Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Picture yourself standing in a vast plaza, surrounded by towering stone pyramids that pierce the jungle canopy. The silence is absolute. Vines crawl across intricate carvings, and the calls of howler monkeys echo where once tens of thousands of voices filled the air. This is Tikal, heart of the ancient Maya world. At its peak, this was just one jewel in a constellation of cities that housed nearly 10 million people. A population that rivaled medieval Europe. They built reservoirs that could hold hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of rainwater. They carved hieroglyphs that told stories of kings and gods. They tracked the stars with mathematical precision that wouldn't be matched for centuries. And then, around 900 AD, something extraordinary happened. The great cities fell silent. But what really happened to 10 million people? Did they truly vanish, or is there a secret hidden in the stones? But before we journey into the jungle, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening tonight? Let me know in the comments. You step from the humid embrace of the Peten rainforest as the last light of day filters through the canopy above. The air hangs heavy with moisture and the earthy scent of decomposing leaves, while somewhere in the distance a howler monkey calls across the gathering twilight. Before you stretches something that should not exist in this wild place, a vast stone plaza, its limestone blocks still fitted together with mathematical precision after more than 1,000 years. This is the Great Plaza of Tikal, and you're standing at the heart of one of history's most profound mysteries. Rising around you like sleeping giants, the temple pyramids pierce the jungle canopy. Temple 2 looms to your left, its steep steps disappearing into shadow. To your right, the massive bulk of Temple 1 reaches toward the darkening sky, its summit crowned with the remnant of a roof comb that once displayed the painted image of a long-dead king. Behind you, the North Acropolis stretches in a maze of courtyards and smaller temples, each stone telling stories in a language that took scholars centuries to decipher. The silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat, the soft whisper of your footsteps on ancient stone, the gentle rustle of leaves as night settles over this forgotten world. But this silence is wrong. Profoundly, impossibly wrong. You're standing in a plaza that once teemed with perhaps 100,000 souls. Imagine, if you can, this very space filled with the voices of merchants calling out their wares, the soft padding of bare feet on stone as people move between the towering temples, the rhythmic beating of drums echoing from the palace compounds that ring this central space. Picture smoke rising from countless cooking fires, the bright colours of feathered headdresses catching the morning sun, the musical cadence of a language that had developed its own written script when most of the world still communicated only through spoken word. This was Tikal, jewel of the Maya lowlands, a city that controlled trade routes stretching from the highlands of Guatemala to the Caribbean coast. But Tikal was just one star in a constellation of urban centres that dotted the southern lowlands during what archaeologists call the late Classic period. To the north lay Calakmul, Tikal's great rival, a city of equal grandeur and ambition. To the east, the elegant temples of Karakol commanded their own network of settlements. Palenque graced the western frontier with some of the finest architectural achievements the Maya ever created. Copan anchored the southeastern reaches with its extraordinary hieroglyphic stairway, a stone library chronicling the deeds of kings whose names we're only now beginning to pronounce correctly. Together, these cities and hundreds of smaller centres supported a population that may have reached 10 million people at its peak. 10 million souls living in a landscape that seems, to our modern eyes, impossibly challenging for such dense settlement. This is tropical rainforest, where surface water is scarce and the rains come in violent seasonal floods before giving way to months of punishing drought. The limestone bedrock swallows rivers before they can flow far, leaving vast stretches of forest with no permanent streams or lakes. Yet here, in this seemingly hostile environment, the Maya built one of the most sophisticated civilizations the ancient Americas ever knew. They carved hieroglyphs that recorded not just the deeds of kings, but also astronomical observations of startling accuracy. They tracked the movements of Venus with a precision that would not be surpassed until the age of telescopes. Their mathematicians worked with concepts of zero and infinity, while much of the world still struggled with basic arithmetic. They built ball courts where ritual games played out cosmic dramas of life and death. They raised stepped pyramids that aligned with celestial events, turning stone and mortar into calendars that could track the passage of centuries. And then, sometime around 900 AD, it began to end. Not with fire and conquest, not with plague or earthquake, but with something far more subtle and far more disturbing. The great construction projects simply stopped. The elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions that had chronicled royal lineages for centuries fell silent. The trade networks that had carried jade and obsidian across thousands of miles began to fracture. Palace courtyards that had echoed with the deliberations of scribes and nobles grew quiet. One by one, the great cities of the southern lowlands began to empty. You walk slowly across the plaza as darkness deepens around you, your footsteps echoing off stones that once supported the weight of multitudes. Somewhere above, in the temple chambers that crown the pyramids, altars still hold the carved records of the last kings to rule this place. Their names ring with ancient authority. Jasorchan Kawil, Dark Sun, rulers whose power once extended across territories larger than many modern nations. But their kingdoms are gone now, reclaimed by the forest that waits patiently at the edge of every human ambition. What happened here? How does a civilization of such sophistication, such resilience, such evident mastery of its environment simply fade away? How do 10 million people seemingly vanish from the historical record, leaving behind only their monuments and their mysteries? These are questions that have puzzled archaeologists, historians and travellers for more than a century. Questions that recent scientific discoveries are only now beginning to answer in ways that illuminate not just the Maya past, but perhaps our own precarious future. To understand how 10 million people could vanish from the rainforest, you must first understand how impossible it was for them to be there in the first place. Journey back with me, not centuries but millennia, to a time when the great temples of Tikal existed only as limestone sleeping beneath layers of sediment and time. Picture yourself standing in this same forest 2,000 years ago, when the only sounds were the calls of jaguars and the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the only lights that pierced the canopy came from distant stars. The landscape that greets you is both beautiful and hostile. You find yourself in what geologists call a karst environment, a world sculpted by the patient work of slightly acidic rainwater, dissolving limestone bedrock over countless millennia. The result is a terrain that seems designed to frustrate human settlement. Rivers disappear into the earth through sinkholes called cenotes, swallowed by underground cave systems that can stretch for hundreds of miles beneath your feet. Surface water, that most basic requirement of human civilization, is scarce and unreliable. What streams do exist often run only during the rainy season, leaving vast stretches of forest completely dry for months at a time. The climate follows a rhythm that would challenge any agricultural society. From May through October, the skies open in torrential downpours that can drop inches of rain in a single afternoon, turning the forest floor into a temporary sea of mud and standing water. But from November through April, the rains cease almost entirely, and the forest becomes a tinderbox of dry leaves and dust. There are no great rivers like the Nile or Euphrates to provide a constant source of water and fertile silt. There are no broad plains of rich soil waiting to be turned by the plough. There are only trees, limestone, and the promise of seasonal floods followed by punishing drought. Yet it was here, in this seemingly impossible landscape, that some of the first Americans began one of history's most remarkable experiments in civilization. The people who would become the Maya arrived in these lowlands sometime around 2000 BC, carrying with them the knowledge of maize cultivation that had been developed in the highlands of central Mexico centuries earlier. But maize as they knew it was not the robust crop that would later feed millions. It was a fragile plant, utterly dependent on human care, producing small ears with kernels that would seem pitifully inadequate to modern eyes. These early settlers faced a fundamental challenge that would shape every aspect of their civilization: how to create abundance from scarcity, how to build permanent communities in a landscape that seemed to offer everything necessary for life except the means to sustain it reliably. Their solution would require not just agricultural innovation, but a complete reimagining of how human societies could organize themselves in relation to their environment. The first step was learning to read the forest itself. These early Maya discovered that what appeared to be an impenetrable wilderness was actually a complex mosaic of micro-environments, each with its own possibilities and limitations. The higher ground, where limestone bedrock lay close to the surface, offered better drainage and protection from seasonal flooding, but the soil was thin and nutrients leached away quickly. The lower areas, called bajos, became temporary lakes during the rainy season, but dried to cracked earth during the drought months, leaving behind rich deposits of organic matter that could nourish crops if properly managed. They learned to clear patches of forest using fire and stone axes, but not in the wasteful manner of later European colonists. Instead, they practiced what archaeologists now recognize as sophisticated agroforestry, maintaining a careful balance between cultivated fields, managed woodland, and wild forest. They discovered that certain trees left standing in their fields could actually improve crop yields by providing shade, fixing nitrogen in the soil, and attracting beneficial insects. They developed techniques for managing the forest's natural succession, allowing cleared areas to regenerate into productive secondary growth that could be harvested for construction materials, medicinal plants, and food. Most crucially, they solved the problem of water. If the landscape would not provide reliable streams and rivers, they would create their own. Beginning perhaps as early as 600 BC, Maya communities began constructing artificial reservoirs, carefully engineered basins lined with clay and stone that could capture and store the seasonal rains. These were not simple ponds, but sophisticated water management systems, complete with dams, canals, and filtration mechanisms that could provide clean drinking water year-round. As these innovations spread and improved, something remarkable began to happen. Villages grew into towns, towns into regional centres, and regional centres into the first true cities of the Maya lowlands. By 250 AD, places like El Mirador and Nakbe were already displaying the monumental architecture that would become the hallmark of Maya civilization. These were not merely collections of houses, but carefully planned urban centres, with massive pyramid complexes, broad plazas, and elaborate water systems that could support populations in the thousands. The emergence of these early cities marked a fundamental transformation in human organisation. Power began to concentrate in the hands of individuals who could command the labour necessary to build and maintain the increasingly complex infrastructure that urban life required. These early rulers legitimised their authority not through conquest alone, but through their perceived ability to ensure the community's survival in an unpredictable environment. They became the guardians of the water systems, the organisers of agricultural labour, and the intermediaries between the human and natural worlds. Step forward now through centuries, leaving behind the tentative beginnings of Maya civilization and entering a world transformed beyond recognition. You find yourself standing once again in the great plaza of Tikal, but this is Tikal as it was in 750 AD, at the height of what archaeologists call the late classic period. The silence that surrounded you in the modern ruins has been replaced by a symphony of human activity that rises and falls like the rhythm of the forest itself. The morning air carries the scent of copal incense drifting from the temple summits, mixed with the earthier aromas of cooking fires and the green smell of fresh maize being ground on stone mateats. Around you, the plaza teems with thousands of people beginning their daily routines. Children chase each other between the legs of adults, their laughter echoing off the limestone walls. Merchants display their wares on woven mats, jade ornaments that catch the early sunlight, obsidian blades sharp enough to cut a hair in half, cacao beans that serve as both currency and the raw material for the bitter drink reserved for nobility. You are witnessing the apex of one of the ancient world's most remarkable achievements, a civilization that supported perhaps 10 million people, without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without large domesticated animals, and without a single unifying empire to coordinate their efforts. Instead, what you see around you is something far more complex and perhaps more resilient, a network of independent city-states, each governing itself while participating in a shared culture that stretched across hundreds of thousands of square miles of tropical forest. The political landscape of the Maya world resembled nothing so much as medieval Europe or ancient Greece, a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each ruled by a divine king called an Ajor, each maintaining its own identity, while engaging in the intricate dance of diplomacy, trade, and occasional warfare that kept the entire system in dynamic equilibrium. From where you stand in Tikal, the great city of Calakmul lies perhaps 90 miles to the north, close enough for their armies to reach each other, but far enough that each could maintain distinct cultural traditions and political alliances. Walk with me now beyond the central plaza, following one of the raised causeways that connect different parts of the city. These limestone pathways, called sakbe or white roads by the Maya, form an urban circulatory system that allows tens of thousands of people to move efficiently through what has become a metropolis covering more than 23 square miles. The causeway you follow leads past residential compounds, where nobles live in multi-storey stone buildings arranged around private courtyards, their walls decorated with painted murals depicting scenes of court life, mythological narratives, and astronomical observations. But Tikal's true marvel lies in its mastery of water, that most precious and unpredictable resource in this forest environment. As you walk, notice how the entire city has been engineered as a vast water collection system. Every plaza, every courtyard, every roof slopes toward carefully constructed channels that carry rainwater into a network of reservoirs carved from the bedrock itself. The largest of these artificial lakes can hold more than 300,000 cubic meters of water, enough to sustain the entire population through even the longest dry season. The engineering required for such a system represents one of humanity's earliest experiments in urban hydrology. Each reservoir is lined with specially prepared clay and fitted with spillways and filtration systems that prevent contamination and control overflow during the heaviest rains. The Maya discovered that certain plants, when grown around the reservoir edges, could help purify the water naturally, while carefully constructed settling basins allowed sediment to separate from drinking water before it entered the main storage areas. This mastery of their environment extended far beyond water management. Follow me now out of the city centre, along paths that lead through the managed forests that surround Tikal's urban core. Here you find yourself in what modern ecologists would recognise as sophisticated agroforestry, where every tree, every cleared space, every planted crop has been chosen to maximise the productivity of the forest ecosystem. The Maya learned to work with their environment rather than against it, creating agricultural systems that could feed enormous populations while actually increasing rather than decreasing the forest's biological diversity. In the fields that stretch between forest and city, you witness agricultural techniques that sustained millions for centuries. Maya farmers developed raised field systems in the seasonal wetlands, creating elevated plots surrounded by canals that provided drainage during floods and irrigation during droughts. They practiced what archaeologists call forest gardening, maintaining complex polycultures where useful trees provided shade and nutrients for crops below, while vines and ground-level plants filled every available niche with food or fibre or medicinal plants. The social organisation required to coordinate such complex systems represented perhaps the Maya's greatest achievement. Unlike the centralised bureaucracies of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Maya society functioned through overlapping networks of kinship, alliance, and obligation that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances while maintaining remarkable stability over centuries. The Ajor at the top of each city-state's hierarchy derived his authority not from military conquest alone, but from his perceived ability to maintain the cosmic order, to ensure the rains came, the crops grew, and the complex urban systems functioned smoothly. Yet this was no despotic system. Archaeological evidence suggests that Maya rulers governed through consultation with councils of nobles, priests, and skilled craftsmen, and that ordinary citizens retained considerable autonomy in their daily lives. The elaborate ritual calendar that governed religious and civic life provided a framework within which individual communities could organize their own festivals, markets, and ceremonies, while participating in the larger cultural patterns that defined Maya civilization. As evening approaches and you make your way back toward the Great Plaza, the sounds of the city shift into their nocturnal rhythms. Drums begin to echo from the palace compounds, calling people to evening ceremonies. Torches flicker to life along the causeways and in the temple doorways. The working day is ending, but the ritual life of the city is just beginning, as priests and nobles prepare for the complex ceremonies that will maintain the balance between human society and the cosmic forces that govern the turning of the seasons. To truly understand the miracle of Maya civilization, you must descend beneath the grand plazas and towering temples into the hidden arteries that made urban life possible in this unlikely landscape. Follow me now down stone steps worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, leaving behind the ceremonial heart of Tikal and entering the ingenious infrastructure that represents perhaps humanity's earliest experiment in sustainable urban design. You find yourself standing at the edge of one of Tikal's great reservoirs, a body of water so vast and so perfectly engineered that early explorers mistook it for a natural lake. The surface stretches away from you in all directions, perhaps 300 meters across and deep enough that you cannot see the bottom, even in the clearest weather. But this is no accident of nature. Every aspect of this artificial lake has been carefully planned and constructed, from the clay-lined basin that prevents seepage to the sophisticated filtration systems that ensure the water remains clean enough to drink after months of storage. Walk slowly around the reservoir's perimeter and notice how the entire urban landscape has been shaped to serve this central purpose. Every building, every plaza, every street slopes almost imperceptibly toward collection points, where rainwater gathers before flowing through carefully constructed channels toward the storage basins. During the height of the rainy season, when afternoon thunderstorms can drop several inches of water in a single hour, you would see the entire city transform into a vast collection system, with thousands of cubic meters of precious water flowing from rooftops and courtyards into the reservoirs that will sustain life through the coming months of drought. The engineering challenges this system presented would have tested the skills of any civilization. The Maya discovered that simply carving basins from limestone bedrock was not enough. Water would seep away through cracks and pores in the stone, leaving the reservoirs empty when they were needed most. Their solution was to develop a sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering, creating multi-layered waterproof barriers using specially prepared clays mixed with organic materials that would expand when wet, creating an impermeable seal. But preventing seepage was only the beginning. These urban water supplies had to remain safe to drink for months at a time, in a tropical climate where contamination could spread disease through entire populations. Archaeological evidence reveals that Maya engineers developed complex filtration systems using layers of sand, gravel, and zeolite minerals that could remove both physical contaminants and harmful bacteria from stored water. They learned to construct settling basins where heavy particles could sink to the bottom before water entered the main reservoirs, and they carefully managed the vegetation around each water source to prevent contamination, while encouraging beneficial plants that could help purify runoff. Move beyond the reservoirs now and follow the ancient pathways that lead into the managed forests surrounding the city. Here you encounter the other half of the equation that made Maya civilization possible, their revolutionary approach to forest use that turned what might have been seen as an obstacle into the foundation of their entire economy. The forest that surrounds you appears wild and untouched, but closer observation reveals a landscape as carefully managed as any formal garden. Every tree species has been chosen for multiple purposes. The towering Cecropia trees provide lightweight wood perfect for construction, while their rapid growth allows them to be harvested sustainably on rotating cycles. The breadnut trees offer protein-rich seeds that can be ground into flour or stored for months as emergency rations. Ramon trees produce nuts that were so important to Maya nutrition that some archaeologists believe they were more significant than maize in supporting large urban populations. Copal trees provide the aromatic resin essential for religious ceremonies, while their wood burns with a clean flame ideal for indoor cooking fires. The understory reveals even more sophisticated forest management. Here you find managed groves of cacao trees, their pods providing the precious beans that served both as currency and as the raw material for the chocolate drinks reserved for nobility. Allspice trees offer both flavorful berries and fragrant wood. Medicinal plants grow in carefully tended patches where healers can harvest them sustainably year after year. Even the seemingly random distribution of useful plants reflects centuries of careful selection and propagation. This forest system extended far beyond individual species to encompass entire ecosystems engineered for human use. In the seasonal wetlands called bajos that lie between the urban ridges, Maya farmers developed raised field agriculture that could produce enormous harvests, while actually improving rather than depleting soil fertility. These raised fields, separated by water-filled canals, created productive microclimates where crop plants could thrive even during the most challenging weather conditions. The canals provided fish and aquatic plants for food, while the organic matter that accumulated in them could be dredged out periodically to fertilize the raised beds. The spatial organization of this entire system reveals a profound understanding of ecological relationships. The city itself occupies the highest ground, where good drainage prevents flooding, and where the limestone bedrock provides a stable foundation for monumental architecture. The managed forests occupy the middle elevations, serving as both productive landscape and protective buffer that moderates the microclimate around the urban areas. The agricultural bayous lie in the lowest areas, where they can capture runoff from the higher elevations while providing the intensive food production necessary to support dense urban populations. What emerges from this careful examination is a picture of environmental management so sophisticated that it challenges many of our assumptions about ancient civilizations. The Maya did not conquer their landscape or exploit it in the destructive manner we often associate with urban development. Instead, they created what modern ecologists would recognize as a carefully balanced system where human needs and environmental health supported each other in a sustainable cycle that functioned successfully for more than 1,000 years. Their cities were not imposed upon the forest, but grew from it, and their prosperity depended not on depleting natural resources, but on enhancing the productivity of the ecosystems they inhabited. Step away now from the reservoirs and managed forests and enter the most mysterious realm of Maya civilization, the intricate web of authority, belief, and social organization that bound millions of people together without the iron grip of empire or the harsh edicts of absolute monarchy. You find yourself climbing the steep steps of Temple 2, ascending toward the burial chamber where one of Tikal's greatest rulers, Jasorchan Kawil, rests surrounded by jade ornaments, ceramic vessels, and the tools of kingship that were meant to accompany him into the afterlife. From this elevated perspective, you can observe the subtle geography of power that shaped daily life in every Maya city. Below you, the Great Plaza stretches in all directions, but notice how it is not a uniform space. Different areas serve different functions, and access to each is carefully controlled by social convention as much as by physical barriers. The central area, directly before the temple where you stand, is reserved for the great state ceremonies where thousands gather to witness the ruler's performance of rituals that maintain cosmic order. But smaller plazas, tucked between palace compounds and residential areas, host the more intimate gatherings where the real work of governance takes place. The Maya political system defies simple categorization. Unlike the pharaohs of Egypt or the emperors of China, Maya rulers governed not through bureaucratic administration, but through what anthropologists call personal kingship, a system where authority flowed from the perceived sacred nature of the ruler rather than from institutional structures that could survive individual deaths. Each Ajor was understood to be the earthly representative of patron deities, responsible for ensuring that the rains came, that crops grew, and that the complex ceremonial calendar that governed religious and civic life proceeded without interruption. Yet this divine authority was far from absolute. Descend now from the temple, and walk through the palace compounds that surround the ceremonial center, noting how power was distributed among numerous specialized roles that served as both supports and constraints on royal authority. The Akuhun, or priests, controlled access to the ritual knowledge that legitimized political power. The Ajetzib, or scribes, maintained the hieroglyphic records that preserved dynastic histories and legal precedents. Skilled craftsmen, organized into hereditary guilds, controlled the production of the luxury goods that displayed royal status and served as diplomatic gifts to other courts. Each of these groups maintained their own compounds, their own traditions, and their own sources of authority that could not be casually dismissed even by divine kings. Archaeological evidence suggests that major decisions required consultation with councils of nobles and specialists, and that rulers who ignored this convention often found their authority challenged by rivals who could claim to represent the true interests of the community. The elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions that cover Maya monuments reveal not the decrees of autocrats, but carefully negotiated statements that had to satisfy multiple constituencies while maintaining the fiction of absolute royal authority. Walk now through the residential areas that extend outward from the ceremonial centre, where the majority of Tikal's population lived and worked. Here you encounter the invisible mechanisms that made Maya civilization possible, the complex networks of kinship, reciprocity, and obligation that organized economic and social life without the need for centralized bureaucracy. Maya society was structured around what anthropologists call corporate groups, extended family networks that controlled specific resources and specialized in particular economic activities while maintaining their own internal governance systems. These family groups were not isolated units, but participants in overlapping networks that connected every individual to the larger community through multiple pathways. A farmer might belong to a kinship group that controlled agricultural land in the Bejos, participate in a craft guild that produced pottery for local and long-distance trade, serve in a military society that defended the city during times of conflict, and hold ceremonial responsibilities in one of the numerous religious societies that maintained specific shrines and festivals throughout the year. This social architecture created remarkable resilience and flexibility. When drought threatened agricultural production, the kinship networks could redistribute food from areas with surplus to those facing shortage. When warfare disrupted one trade route, the craft guilds could shift production toward different markets accessed through alternative channels. When political succession disputes threatened stability, the various corporate groups could negotiate compromises that preserved community cohesion while allowing for necessary changes in leadership. The ritual calendar that governed Maya life served not merely as religious observance, but as the temporal framework within which all these social mechanisms operated. The elaborate ceremonies that marked important dates in the calendar provided occasions for different groups to demonstrate their contributions to community welfare, for disputes to be resolved through formal procedures, and for the complex negotiations that maintained social balance to take place in contexts that emphasize shared values rather than competing interests. This system of governance through consensus rather than coercion helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of Maya civilization: how such a complex society could function for centuries without the massive administrative apparatus that characterized other ancient civilizations. The Maya achieved coordination not through bureaucratic control, but through cultural integration, creating shared systems of meaning and value that made cooperation more attractive than conflict, while preserving enough autonomy for individual communities to adapt to changing circumstances without waiting for orders from distant capitals. Leave behind now the intricate social mechanisms of individual cities and journey outward with me along the ancient pathways that connected the Maya world to itself and to the broader tapestry of Mesoamerican civilization. You find yourself following a well-worn trail that leads away from Tikal's ceremonial center, heading northeast through managed forests toward the distant cities that lie scattered across hundreds of miles of tropical landscape. These are the trade routes that carried far more than mere goods between communities. They were the arteries through which flowed the ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations that made Maya civilization possible. The path beneath your feet has been traveled for centuries by merchants, diplomats, pilgrims, and messengers, each carrying their own portion of the complex web of relationships that bound the Maya world together. Unlike the Roman roads that imposed imperial unity through standardized engineering, these Maya routes followed the natural contours of the landscape, adapting to seasonal flooding, taking advantage of high ground, and connecting the scattered cities through networks that resembled the organic growth of forest ecosystems rather than the geometric precision of centralized planning. As you walk, imagine the processions of merchants that once traveled these same paths. They moved in groups for safety, their loads carried on the backs of human porters since the Maya had no large domesticated animals suitable for transport. Each merchant expedition represented a complex negotiation between supply and demand across vast distances, carrying goods that were available in abundance in one region to places where they were scarce and highly valued. The green jade that adorned Maya nobility came from distant mines in the Motagua Valley of Guatemala, requiring journeys of hundreds of miles through territory controlled by multiple competing kingdoms. The logistics of such trade reveal the sophisticated coordination that characterized Maya commerce. Obsidian, that volcanic glass sharper than any metal blade, came primarily from highland sources in central Mexico and Guatemala. For this precious cutting material to reach craftsmen in Tikal or Calakmul required not just long-distance transport, but complex arrangements for safe passage through territories controlled by rulers who might be allied one year and at war the next. The merchant networks that made such trade possible operated through relationships that transcended political boundaries, creating economic incentives for peace that often proved stronger than the ambitions of individual kings. Follow the trade route now as it leads you toward the Caribbean coast, where Maya merchants accessed resources that were impossible to obtain in the forest interior. Here, in the coastal settlements, you would have encountered the remarkable sight of Maya traders negotiating with seagoing peoples who brought marine shells, salt, and exotic goods from islands scattered across the Caribbean. The conch shells that provided the deep, resonant horns used in Maya ceremonies came from these coastal waters, as did the colourful shells that were carved into intricate ornaments for noble dress. But perhaps the most significant trade goods were the least exotic, the surplus food production that allowed some Maya cities to support populations far larger than their local agricultural systems could sustain. The raised field agriculture of the Beyos could produce enormous yields of maize, beans, and other staple foods, creating surpluses that could be traded to cities located in areas less suitable for intensive farming. This agricultural trade was the foundation that supported all other economic activity, allowing cities to specialize in craft production, ceremony, and governance while importing the food necessary to feed their populations. The cacao trade deserves particular attention, for this was more than simple commerce. The chocolate drink prepared from cacao beans was reserved for nobility and played a central role in diplomatic and religious ceremonies. The beans themselves served as a standardized currency that facilitated trade across the entire region. A single turkey might cost 100 cacao beans, while a tomato was worth just one bean. This monetary system allowed for complex commercial calculations and helped standardize exchange rates across vast distances, creating economic integration that transcended political fragmentation. Yet these same trade networks that brought prosperity and cultural exchange also created vulnerabilities that few recognized at the time. Cities that became dependent on imported food or specialized in producing goods for distant markets found themselves exposed when trade routes were disrupted by warfare, political upheaval, or environmental changes. The very connectivity that made Maya civilization so dynamic and resilient also meant that problems in one region could cascade rapidly through the entire system, turning local difficulties into widespread crises. The diplomatic implications of trade were equally complex. Marriage alliances between ruling families created networks of obligation and support that could stabilize entire regions, but they could also drag previously neutral cities into conflicts that originated hundreds of miles away. The elaborate gift exchange that accompanied diplomatic visits created expectations of reciprocity that could strain royal treasuries during times of reduced trade or agricultural shortfalls. As you make your way back toward Tikal along paths now familiar, consider how this intricate web of connections made the Maya world both more prosperous and more fragile than isolated communities might have been. Step away now from the grand narratives of kings and trade networks and descend into the quieter rhythms that sustained Maya civilization, day by day, season by season, generation by generation. You find yourself walking, not along the ceremonial causeways but on the smaller paths that wind through residential compounds, following routes worn smooth by countless bare feet, carrying water from the reservoirs, hauling baskets of maize from distant fields, moving through the daily choreography of survival that made all other achievements possible. The first light of dawn finds you in one of the agricultural areas that stretch between Tikal's urban core and the surrounding forest. Here, in the rich soil of the Beyos, where seasonal flooding deposits nutrients carried down from the higher elevations, Maya farmers begin their daily work before the tropical sun makes labor unbearable. You watch as families emerge from simple thatch-roofed houses, the adults carrying the stone tools and woven baskets that will organize their day, the children following behind with smaller versions of the same implements, learning through imitation the skills that will sustain them throughout their lives. The agricultural calendar that governs their activities reflects an intimate knowledge of local conditions developed over centuries of careful observation. These farmers know precisely when the first rains will arrive, how long they can expect the wet season to last, which varieties of maize will thrive in different types of soil, and how to time their planting to take maximum advantage of the brief period when conditions are perfect for germination. Their fields are not the monoculture plantations of later agricultural systems, but complex polycultures where maize grows alongside beans that fix nitrogen in the soil, squash that provides ground cover to retain moisture, and dozens of other useful plants that contribute protein, vitamins, medicines, and materials for tools and clothing. Follow one family now as they make their way to their assigned plots in the raised field system. The father carries a simple digging stick, its fire-hardened point sharpened to penetrate even the most compacted soil. The mother bears a large basket woven from forest vines, designed to carry the day's harvest back to their compound. Their teenage daughter has a smaller basket and the stone matate on which she will grind maize into flour. Their young son carries gourds for water and the obsidian blades that will be needed for harvesting and food preparation. The work that occupies them is both physically demanding and intellectually sophisticated. They must constantly monitor soil conditions, adjusting their techniques as the season progresses and the water levels in the canal systems change. They practice what modern agriculturalists would recognize as sustainable farming, rotating crops to prevent soil depletion, allowing fields to lie fallow periodically to restore fertility, and maintaining careful records of which techniques produce the best results under different conditions. Their knowledge encompasses not just the practical skills of planting and harvesting, but a deep understanding of ecological relationships that allows them to work with natural systems rather than against them. As the morning progresses and the sun climbs higher, you shift your attention to the craft workshops that occupy specialized compounds throughout the city. In one courtyard, potters work clay that has been carefully prepared with organic tempers, shaping vessels that range from simple cooking pots to elaborate ceremonial urns decorated with complex iconographic programs. The master potter, a middle-aged woman whose hands bear the calluses of decades at her craft, instructs younger apprentices in the precise techniques required to create walls of uniform thickness, to achieve the specific colours that identify different ceramic traditions, and to apply the painted decorations that mark vessels as products of particular workshops. In another compound, stonemasons shape the limestone blocks that will become part of new construction projects, using techniques passed down through generations of specialised craftsmen. Their tools are simple but effective: stone hammers for rough shaping, wooden wedges for splitting large blocks, abrasive stones for smoothing surfaces, and obsidian flakes for the detailed carving that transforms raw stone into architectural sculpture. The work requires not just physical strength but mathematical precision, since each block must fit perfectly into its assigned position in structures that will stand for centuries. Move now through the residential areas where most of Tikal's population lives, noting how daily life unfolds in patterns that connect individual households to the larger urban community. Women gather at the communal wells that provide access to the reservoir system, their conversations creating informal networks through which news, gossip, and practical knowledge flow throughout the city. Children play games that teach them the skills they will need as adults, racing along the causeways with miniature versions of adult tools, practicing the elaborate ball game that serves both as entertainment and as preparation for the ritual contests that mark important ceremonial occasions. The markets that spring up in various plazas throughout the city create meeting places where urban and rural populations exchange not just goods, but information about weather patterns, crop conditions, political developments, and social changes that affect the entire region. Here, farmers trade surplus food for the specialized products of urban craftsmen: obsidian tools, ceramic vessels, woven textiles, jade ornaments, and the countless other items that make civilized life possible. The transactions involve not just immediate exchanges, but complex relationships of credit, obligation, and reciprocity that bind participants into networks of mutual dependency, extending far beyond simple commerce. As evening approaches and families gather for the communal meals that mark the end of each day's labour, you observe how individual efforts contribute to collective prosperity. The maize ground on family metes becomes tortillas shared with neighbours and relatives. The clay vessels shaped in workshop courtyards hold water carried by children from the great reservoirs. The stone tools crafted by specialised artisans enable the agricultural work that feeds the entire community. Every aspect of daily life reflects the interdependence that made Maya civilization possible, the quiet cooperation that sustained millions of people for centuries in one of the world's most challenging environments. The same sun rises over Tikal as it has for centuries, casting the same golden light across the great plaza, illuminating the same limestone temples that have stood sentinel over this forest city for generations. But something has begun to change, something so subtle that it might escape casual observation, yet profound enough to threaten the foundations of everything you have witnessed in this remarkable civilization. You stand once again beside the great reservoir that has sustained this city through countless dry seasons. But look more carefully now at the water that reflects the morning sky. The surface no longer holds the crystal clarity you might have observed decades earlier. Instead, a faint cloudiness suggests sediment suspended in the water, particles of soil and organic matter that should have been filtered out by the elaborate purification systems that Maya engineers designed to keep their urban water supply clean and safe. Walk along the reservoir's edge and you can see evidence of the gradual changes that are beginning to stress the systems that made this city possible. The stone-lined channels that carry runoff from the plazas show signs of increased erosion, their carefully fitted blocks loosened by floods that seem to arrive with greater violence than in previous generations. The forest that surrounds the city tells a similar story of subtle transformation. The managed woodland that once provided sustainable yields of construction timber, fuel, and forest products shows signs of increasing pressure from human demands that may be approaching the limits of what these ecosystems can provide. Trees that were once harvested selectively according to careful rotational schedules now show evidence of more intensive cutting, with younger specimens being taken and less attention paid to maintaining the age diversity that ensured continuous productivity. In some areas, the forest floor reveals patches where erosion has begun to strip away the thin soil layer that supports the complex understory plants that provided food, medicine, and raw materials for craft production. The agricultural bajos that feed the city show their own signs of strain. The raised field systems that once produced abundant harvests now require more intensive maintenance to prevent the canals from silting up during the increasingly unpredictable flood seasons. Farmers report that the careful timing that once ensured successful crops has become less reliable as rainfall patterns shift in ways that challenge traditional knowledge. Some fields that produced consistently for generations now experience periodic failures that force communities to rely more heavily on stored reserves or trade relationships to meet their nutritional needs. These environmental pressures create ripple effects that extend throughout Maya society. In the workshops where craftsmen produce the goods that maintain trade relationships with distant cities, artisans find that some raw materials are becoming more difficult to obtain. The high-quality clays needed for certain types of ceremonial pottery must now be imported from greater distances as local sources show signs of depletion. The specific types of stone used for particular architectural elements require longer expeditions to quarry sites that were once easily accessible, but now lie in territories controlled by increasingly suspicious neighbouring cities. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that chronicle royal activities during this period begin to reveal subtle changes in the concerns that occupy Maya rulers. Where earlier texts celebrated successful building projects and diplomatic achievements, later inscriptions increasingly mention warfare, defensive preparations, and negotiations over resource access. The elaborate gift exchanges that once cemented alliances between cities become more difficult to maintain as luxury goods become scarcer and communities become more protective of their resources. Archaeological evidence suggests that the population of Tikal and other major cities may have reached levels that strain the carrying capacity of their agricultural and water management systems. The residential areas that extend outward from the ceremonial centres show signs of increasing density, with new construction filling in previously open spaces and existing compounds being subdivided to accommodate more families. This urban growth places additional demands on infrastructure that was designed for smaller populations, requiring more intensive maintenance of water systems and increasing pressure on the agricultural areas that must feed larger numbers of people. The trade networks that once brought prosperity to Maya cities begin to show signs of disruption as political relationships between different centres become more volatile. Routes that were once considered safe require larger escort parties or must be abandoned entirely when local conflicts make passage too dangerous. Cities that specialised in producing particular goods for export find their markets disrupted when traditional trading partners become unreliable or hostile. Yet these changes unfold gradually, almost imperceptibly to people living through them. Each individual season might bring minor variations in rainfall or small disruptions in trade that could be attributed to normal fluctuations. Each minor conflict between cities might be seen as a temporary diplomatic problem that would eventually be resolved through negotiation. The slow degradation of water quality, or the gradual depletion of forest resources, might not be immediately apparent to people whose lives span only decades, while the changes unfold across generations. What you are witnessing is not the dramatic collapse that later storytellers would imagine, with cities abandoned overnight and populations fleeing in panic. Instead, this is the beginning of a more complex process of transformation, as the intricate systems that sustained Maya civilization begin to experience stresses that challenge their resilience. The very achievements that made this society possible, the intensive agriculture, the complex urban infrastructure, the extensive trade networks, create vulnerabilities that become apparent only when environmental and social pressures begin to exceed the adaptive capacity of existing institutions. You stand now at the edge of what was once Tikal's most reliable water source, but the reservoir that stretches before you bears little resemblance to the engineering marvel that sustained this city for centuries. The water level has dropped dramatically, revealing stone-lined walls that were meant to remain submerged. Along the exposed banks, you can see layers of sediment that tell the story of a system under increasing stress, each stratum marking seasons when erosion overwhelmed the filtration mechanisms that once kept this water clean and clear. The algae that now covers much of the surface creates an unpleasant smell that would have been unthinkable during the height of Tikal's prosperity. What you are witnessing is not simply the result of seasonal drought, but evidence of a more fundamental breakdown in the relationship between human society and the environment that had sustained it for so long. Recent scientific analysis of sediment cores taken from reservoirs throughout the Maya lowlands reveals a story that challenges many of our assumptions about how complex civilizations end. The climate data preserved in these ancient lake beds tells of rainfall reductions that would have tested any agricultural system, but the Maya faced something far worse than simple drought. Between 850 and 900 AD, the region experienced what paleoclimatologists now recognize as a period of extreme climate instability, with rainfall patterns that shifted dramatically from year to year in ways that made traditional farming techniques unreliable. Some years brought the violent floods that overwhelmed water management systems designed for more predictable seasonal patterns. Other years delivered droughts so severe that even the most carefully maintained reservoirs could not provide enough water to sustain large urban populations. Walk slowly around the perimeter of this failing reservoir and observe how the same engineering sophistication that once made Maya cities possible became a source of vulnerability when environmental conditions changed beyond the parameters for which these systems were designed. The elaborate network of channels, dams, and filtration basins required constant maintenance under the best of circumstances. But when irregular rainfall patterns began to deposit unprecedented amounts of sediment during flash floods followed by extended dry periods, the labour required to keep the system functioning began to exceed what urban populations could provide. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that chronicle the final decades of the Classic period reveal rulers struggling with problems that their predecessors never faced. Where earlier kings celebrated successful building projects and military victories, the texts from this period increasingly focus on desperate attempts to maintain the infrastructure that urban life required. Kings who had once commissioned elaborate temple complexes now directed their resources toward dredging silted reservoirs, repairing damaged dams and organizing work parties to maintain the agricultural terraces that were increasingly threatened by erosion. Archaeological evidence from Tikal and other major centers reveals the painful choices that communities faced as their environmental support systems began to fail. Construction of new monumental architecture virtually ceased after 850 AD, not because Maya rulers lost interest in displaying their power, but because the labour force previously available for such projects was desperately needed to maintain the basic infrastructure that kept cities functioning. The skilled craftsmen who had once produced elaborate carved monuments were reassigned to more practical tasks like reservoir maintenance and agricultural intensification. Yet the myth of sudden collapse that has dominated popular understanding of Maya history obscures the more complex reality of how societies actually respond to environmental crisis. Rather than simply abandoning their cities in panic, Maya communities made rational adaptations to changing circumstances, even when those adaptations ultimately proved insufficient. Population began to shift away from the largest urban centres towards smaller settlements that could be sustained with less intensive water management systems. Trade networks that had once connected dozens of major cities contracted to serve smaller, more localized economies. Some communities attempted technological solutions that pushed Maya engineering to its limits. At Tikal, archaeological evidence suggests that engineers tried to expand reservoir capacity by constructing additional storage basins, but these emergency measures could not compensate for the fundamental changes in rainfall patterns that were affecting the entire region. Other cities experimented with new agricultural techniques designed to make farming less dependent on predictable water supplies, but these innovations came too late to prevent the social disruptions that were already underway. The political consequences of environmental stress created cascading failures that amplified the impact of climate change. As agricultural productivity declined and water became scarce, the trade relationships that had allowed cities to specialize in different economic activities began to break down. Communities that had previously exchanged agricultural surpluses for manufactured goods found themselves forced to become more self-sufficient, reducing the economic integration that had made Maya civilization so dynamic and resilient. Warfare between cities, which had once been limited and ritualized, became more destructive as communities competed for access to increasingly scarce resources. The elaborate diplomatic protocols that had maintained stability between different kingdoms gave way to more desperate conflicts over water rights and agricultural land. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increased fortification of cities and changes in settlement patterns that suggest populations living under the constant threat of attack. What you are witnessing, as you stand beside this failing reservoir, is not the mysterious disappearance of an entire civilization, but the gradual transformation of a complex society under environmental and social pressures that exceeded its adaptive capacity. The Maya did not vanish. They adapted, migrated, and continued their cultural traditions in new forms and new locations. But the urban civilization that had flourished in these southern lowlands for more than 6 centuries was coming to an end, not in a single catastrophic moment, but through a prolonged process of adjustment to a world that had fundamentally changed. The Great Plaza lies before you now, but it's no longer the vibrant center of urban life that once drew thousands of people to witness ceremonies and conduct the business that sustained Maya civilization. Morning light filters through the forest canopy overhead, illuminating stone surfaces that show the first signs of surrender to the patient work of roots and weather. Vines have begun to establish themselves in the joints between limestone blocks, and small trees have taken root in the accumulated soil that gathers in corners where human maintenance once swept every surface clean. Walk slowly across the plaza and listen to the quality of silence that has settled over this place. It is not the absolute quiet of abandonment, but something more complex, a transformation in the rhythm of human activity that speaks to profound changes in how people organize their lives and communities. The great temple pyramids still rise around you, their bulk undiminished by the passage of decades. But notice how the smaller structures that once bustled with daily activity show signs of deliberate modification rather than simple neglect. Here, a palace compound has been partially dismantled, its carefully cut stone blocks removed for reuse in smaller, more practical construction projects elsewhere in the city. There, a ceremonial platform has been converted into a foundation for simpler buildings, designed to house smaller populations with more modest aspirations. These are not the random modifications of looters or the chaotic destruction that follows military conquest, but evidence of communities making rational decisions about how to adapt their built environment to changing circumstances. The hieroglyphic record tells this story with poignant economy. The last dated monument at Tikal bears the date 899 AD, marking not just the end of a tradition of royal commemoration that had continued for centuries, but the conclusion of the political system that made such monuments meaningful. Similar dates mark the final inscriptions at dozens of other Maya cities across the southern lowlands, creating a pattern that archaeologists call the Maya collapse, but which might more accurately be understood as the Maya transformation. Yet this transformation was neither uniform nor complete. Follow the ancient causeways that lead away from Tikal's ceremonial centre, and you find evidence of communities that persisted even as the great urban centres lost their ability to support large populations. Small farming settlements continued to thrive in areas where local water sources remained reliable, and where agricultural techniques could be adjusted to changing environmental conditions. These communities maintained many of the cultural traditions that defined Maya identity, while abandoning the elaborate political and ceremonial structures that had characterized the classic period. Archaeological evidence reveals fascinating patterns of selective abandonment that challenge simple narratives of civilizational collapse. Communities chose to maintain some buildings while allowing others to fall into disrepair, suggesting careful decisions about which aspects of urban life were essential and which could be sacrificed when resources became scarce. Residential compounds that housed ordinary families often show continuous occupation well into the 10th century, while the elaborate palace complexes of the nobility were abandoned much earlier. The demographic shift that occurred during this period represents one of the largest population movements in pre-Columbian American history. Millions of people who had lived in the dense urban centers of the southern lowlands migrated to other regions where environmental conditions remained more favorable for the kind of intensive agriculture that Maya civilization required. Some moved north into the Yucatan Peninsula, where different geological conditions provided access to groundwater through natural sinkholes called cenotes. Others retreated to highland areas where more reliable rainfall made farming less dependent on complex water management systems. This migration was not a panicked exodus, but a gradual process of adaptation that unfolded over several generations. Extended families made decisions about where their best opportunities lay, sometimes dividing to pursue different strategies while maintaining connections that would allow for reunion if circumstances changed. Trade networks that had once connected dozens of major cities contracted but did not disappear entirely, continuing to link the scattered communities that maintained Maya cultural traditions in their new environments. The architectural evidence from this period reveals particularly poignant insights into how communities adapted their physical environments to reflect changing social realities. Construction techniques became simpler and more practical, reflecting both reduced labor availability and changing priorities that emphasized functional shelter over ceremonial display. But even these modest buildings often incorporated decorative elements and spatial arrangements that preserved essential aspects of Maya architectural tradition, suggesting communities determined to maintain their cultural identity even as they abandoned the monumental expressions of earlier centuries. In some locations, you can still observe the careful ways that communities disassembled the infrastructure of urban life while preserving what could be salvaged for future use. Stone blocks from temple stairs were recut to create household altars where family ceremonies could continue even without the elaborate public rituals of the classic period. Carved monuments were sometimes broken up and incorporated into new construction, ensuring that fragments of historical memory would survive even if the political systems they commemorated had disappeared. The forest itself began to reclaim spaces that had been kept clear through human labor for centuries, but this too was not a simple process of natural succession. Many areas that appear to be wild forest to modern eyes actually represent managed landscapes where Maya communities continued to practice agroforestry and selective cultivation long after they abandoned intensive urban agriculture. Archaeological surveys reveal that some areas that were thought to be uninhabited after the collapse actually supported small populations that maintained traditional subsistence practices while avoiding the risks associated with large-scale settlement. This gradual transformation, extending over decades and involving millions of individual decisions about how to adapt to changing circumstances, represents human resilience on a scale that challenges our understanding of how societies respond to environmental crisis. The Maya who lived through this period did not simply disappear or fail to adapt. Instead, they demonstrated remarkable flexibility in reshaping their civilization to survive in a world that no longer supported the elaborate urban systems their ancestors had created. Journey forward now through centuries of silence, leaving behind the final generation of classic Maya rulers and entering a world where the forest has begun its patient work of reclamation. You stand once more in what was the great plaza of Tikal, but you must imagine it as it appeared not decades but centuries after the last ceremonies echoed, from these stone steps when the managed landscape of the classic period had given way to the slower rhythms of natural succession and human adaptation. The trees that now tower above you, their canopy so dense that little sunlight reaches the forest floor, tell a story of remarkable ecological resilience. What appears to be virgin rainforest is actually a complex palimpsest, where natural regeneration has written itself over the careful environmental management that sustained Maya civilization for more than 6 centuries. Yet even in their apparent wilderness, these forests bear the subtle signatures of human influence that shaped their development in ways that would not be recognized until modern ecological research revealed the depth of Maya environmental engineering. Walk carefully through the undergrowth that now carpets areas once kept meticulously clear for ceremonial purposes, and you may notice that the tree species composition is not quite what you would expect in completely natural forest. The prevalence of useful species, breadnut trees, ramon trees, copal trees, and dozens of others that provided food, medicine, and raw materials to Maya communities, suggests forest gardens that continued to be managed long after the great cities lost their ability to support large populations. Even as monumental architecture surrendered to the embrace of roots and weather, the practical knowledge of forest management passed from generation to generation among communities that maintained traditions of sustainable resource use. The archaeological rediscovery of places like Tikal represents one of the most remarkable detective stories in the history of human knowledge. When explorers like John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood first penetrated these forests in the 1840s, they found temples so completely enveloped by vegetation that entire pyramids appeared to be natural hills covered with trees centuries old. The labour required to clear away this accumulated growth and reveal the architectural marvels beneath required decades of painstaking work by archaeologists, who often had to become botanists and ecologists as well as historians. Modern research techniques have revolutionized our understanding of what actually happened during the period once dismissed as simply collapse. Satellite imagery and aerial laser scanning technologies can now detect subtle variations in forest canopy that reveal the outlines of ancient structures invisible from ground level. Core samples taken from lake beds and ancient reservoirs preserve chemical signatures that allow scientists to reconstruct not just climate patterns, but also population levels, agricultural intensity, and even the specific types of crops that were grown in different areas during different periods. Perhaps most remarkably, the water management systems that were central to Maya urban life have provided an inadvertent archive of environmental change that spans more than 2,000 years. The sediments that accumulated in reservoirs contain pollen grains that reveal which plants were growing in the surrounding watersheds, microscopic charcoal particles that indicate patterns of forest burning and agricultural clearing, and chemical traces that document everything from rainfall patterns to soil erosion rates. These repositories of ancient environmental data have allowed researchers to reconstruct the complex interactions between climate change, human activity, and ecological transformation that shaped Maya history. Yet the story revealed by this scientific research is not simply one of environmental determinism or inevitable collapse. The Maya communities that survived the transformation of the 9th and 10th centuries demonstrated remarkable adaptability, maintaining core aspects of their cultural identity while developing new strategies for sustainable living in a changed world. In the northern Yucatan, where geological conditions provided access to groundwater through natural cenotes, Maya civilization experienced a remarkable renaissance during what archaeologists call the post-classic period. Cities like Chichen Itza and later Mayapan became centers of trade networks that extended throughout Mesoamerica and into the Caribbean, demonstrating that Maya political and economic institutions could adapt successfully to new environmental conditions. The architectural styles that developed during this period reflected both continuity with classic Maya traditions and innovation in response to different challenges and opportunities. The cultural memory of the classic period cities was preserved in oral traditions, ritual practices, and artistic motifs that connected later Maya communities to their ancestral achievements. The Spanish conquest of the 16th century brought new disruptions to Maya communities, but even colonial pressures could not entirely suppress the cultural traditions that had survived the environmental crises of the 9th and 10th centuries. Maya languages, agricultural techniques, craft traditions, and religious practices persisted through centuries of imposed change, creating the foundation for the cultural revival that characterizes contemporary Maya communities throughout Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. The forest that surrounds you now as you stand among the ruins of Tikal represents neither simple destruction nor complete renewal, but something more complex. A landscape where human and natural history have become so intertwined that neither can be understood without reference to the other. The ecological richness that characterizes these protected forests today reflects not just natural regeneration, but the legacy of centuries of sophisticated environmental management that created conditions conducive to biodiversity and ecosystem stability. This continuity between past and present offers profound lessons for contemporary societies facing their own environmental challenges, suggesting that resilience lies not in resistance to change, but in the wisdom to adapt cultural institutions and economic practices to the realities of environmental limits, while preserving the essential values that define human community and meaning. You sit now in the stillness of the Great Plaza as evening shadows lengthen across stones that have witnessed the rise and transformation of one of humanity's most remarkable civilizations. The forest that surrounds you hums with the quiet sounds of dusk, the distant call of howler monkeys, the rustle of leaves as night-flying creatures begin their ancient routines, the soft whisper of wind through branches that have grown to great height, above monuments once alive with human ceremony and purpose. The story you have followed through these chapters speaks to something far larger than the particular fate of the Maya cities in the southern lowlands during the 9th and 10th centuries. It offers a meditation on the nature of human achievement, the relationship between societies and their environments, and the complex processes through which civilizations adapt, transform, and endure across the vast scales of historical time. The silence that now envelops this place is not the silence of failure, but of transformation. Not the end of a story, but its passage into new forms of meaning and memory. Consider what the Maya accomplished in this challenging landscape. The creation of urban centers that supported millions of people without destroying the forests that sustained them. The development of agricultural systems that enhanced, rather than depleted, the productivity of tropical ecosystems. The maintenance of complex trade networks that connected diverse communities across vast distances while preserving local autonomy and cultural distinctiveness. These achievements represent alternative approaches to the fundamental challenges that all human societies face: how to create abundance from scarcity, how to organize complex communities without sacrificing individual dignity, how to build institutions that can adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential values. The water management systems that were central to Maya urban life offer particularly relevant lessons for contemporary societies grappling with questions of sustainability and resilience. The reservoirs whose engineering marvels you have explored throughout this narrative represent more than impressive technical achievements. They embody a philosophy of living within environmental limits that contemporary civilization has largely forgotten. Maya engineers understood that true security lay not in conquering nature, but in creating human systems so carefully attuned to natural cycles that they could thrive within the constraints that the environment imposed. Yet the story of the classic Maya also serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of even the most carefully designed systems when environmental conditions change beyond the parameters for which those systems were created. The climate instability that challenged Maya civilization during the 9th century offers sobering parallels to the environmental changes that contemporary societies must navigate. The lesson is not that technological sophistication provides immunity from environmental constraints, but rather that resilience requires the wisdom to recognize when existing approaches are no longer adequate and the courage to make fundamental adaptations before crisis becomes catastrophe. The political organization of Maya society provides equally important insights for our understanding of how human communities can maintain cohesion and cooperation across large scales without sacrificing local autonomy. The network of independent city-states that characterized the Maya world offers an alternative to both the centralized bureaucracies and the market-driven individualism that dominate contemporary political imagination. Maya communities found ways to coordinate their activities and resolve conflicts through cultural integration rather than institutional control, creating systems of governance that were both effective and respectful of human dignity. Perhaps most importantly, the Maya story challenges simplistic narratives about civilizational success and failure that often distort our understanding of historical change. The transformation of Maya society during the terminal classic period was not a collapse in any meaningful sense, but an adaptation to changing circumstances that preserved essential aspects of Maya culture, while abandoning institutional forms that were no longer sustainable. The millions of Maya people living today in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras represent not the survivors of a failed civilization, but the inheritors of cultural traditions sophisticated enough to adapt to centuries of environmental and political change. The archaeological sites that preserve the material remains of classic Maya civilization serve as reminders of both human achievement and human transience, monuments to the creativity and ingenuity that characterize our species, while also testifying to the impermanence that marks all human endeavors. The stones that form these ancient plazas will outlast the civilizations that built them, just as they have outlasted the forest kingdoms that once gave them meaning. But the ideas and insights preserved in their arrangement continue to offer wisdom to contemporary communities facing their own challenges of adaptation and survival. As you prepare to leave this place and return to your own world, carry with you the knowledge that history is both gone and present, that the voices of the past continue to speak to those willing to listen carefully to their messages. The reservoirs that once sustained great cities now hold only rainwater and fallen leaves, but their engineering principles remain valid. The trade routes that once connected distant communities have been reclaimed by forest, but the relationships they fostered between diverse peoples offer models for contemporary cooperation. The ceremonies that once filled these plazas with music and colour have faded into silence, but the values they expressed about human dignity and environmental stewardship remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. Sleep well, knowing that human wisdom, like the forest itself, has remarkable powers of regeneration, and that the most important lessons of the past are never truly lost, but await rediscovery by each generation willing to seek them with patience and humility.